Great. So again, my name is Matthew McIver. I'm with the Iowa Cultural Coalition, organizing Iowans to advocate for increased investment in arts and culture. It is a wild time in the arts and culture landscape and in the nonprofit landscape in general, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you. So I want to absolutely thank all of you for taking some time today to join us. We'll do a little bit of a legislative look forward, touching briefly on what's going on at the federal level and a little more specifically on the Iowa legislature, particularly as it overlaps with arts and culture. We're going to talk about the Create in Iowa report that came out this week from the Iowa Cultural Coalition in collaboration with the Iowa Arts Council. And we're going to talk about advocacy approaches and tactics as we move towards Cultural Advocacy Day, our day on the Hill on March 5th coming up. Just in the chat, folks, if you would just drop your name, who you're with, and where you're from. I think we have folks from around the state, and that's very exciting for us. So we really appreciate your taking the time out of your day to come and join us. So again, I'm Matt. I'm in Des Moines on the Iowa Cultural Coalition board. John from the Engler, great. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. Let us know where you're from. I'm going to dive into our sort of high-level look, and we'll start with a legislative look forward. We'll do a brief look at the federal landscape. We'll look at the Iowa legislature, and we'll talk a bit about the Create in Iowa report. So the federal landscape, I think chaos is honestly a fair term for where we are in terms of the blizzard of executive orders that have come out of the Trump administration in the last 3 weeks or so. There have been, as we all know by the skin of our teeth, stopping of all grants, then belaying of that, both a lawsuit. There have been various things about websites coming down, information being stripped off of websites. It's been an absolute blizzard. I'm not going to pretend that we at the Iowa Cultural Coalition can give you every piece of information or answer every question that you have on that. I think the most important thing to note is that it is an ongoing process. They are continuing to come out with new orders. Those orders are getting blowback, pushback of various kinds. And now there are a number of lawsuits involved, some of which are actively blocking some of the orders, like the one in terms of federal grants. This is going to take a while to settle down and play out. So I think some of the most important things to say is that you want to connect with reliable resources, and you absolutely do want to take an opportunity to connect with your legislators and let them know of your support for arts and culture funding at the federal level. I think it's really important that we have that kind of word in the ear, because there's a lot of noise going on currently, and the legislators are hearing a lot of things from a lot of different people. One source that I would strongly recommend to you is the National Council of Nonprofits. They have here on the screen a link where they are tracking the executive orders. Oops. I'll drop this link in the chat. They are tracking these executive orders. They have charts of the executive orders. It's a great resource. It's a great opportunity to sort of stay up with an organization that is staying close to this and looking very closely at its impact on nonprofit world. A lot of arts organizations, not all arts organizations are nonprofits, obviously, but certainly a lot of them are, and those can be very heavily affected by the landscape of what's going on right now. So National Council of Nonprofits is a great resource. Specifically, this coming Friday, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central, they are having a webinar on the executive actions and their impact on charitable nonprofits. I've been involved. Many people on this call have been involved in more than one of those conversations recently. The Iowa Nonprofit Alliance, that we'll talk about in a minute, recently hosted one with a number of different states. And so it's great. It's a great opportunity, I think, to see what the National Council, what they're tracking at a very high level, and the impacts that they see rolling down and where we are with this. One of the things that I would just say for all of us is I genuinely don't think this is going to settle down anytime soon. This seems to be an administration that believes that sort of chaos is an operating mode that works for them, and they seem to be very focused on that, and very very willing to carry that policy forward. So for us, I think finding a way to keep track of it without going crazy over every news release is probably the most important thing. And there is a good bit we can focus on here at the Iowa level that hopefully we will be able to be effective at, and that we can, in fact, move the needle on some things. There may be some opportunity. Was emailing with Leon Keener, who's the Iowa Alliance for Arts Education, has done a lot of coordinating lobbying at the federal level. And he thinks there's probably going to be another round of that again. It often happens in the spring. So if you know Leon and are interested in engaging in that, reach out to him. He's always looking for folks to help with those efforts too. Those are usually Zoom calls with federal legislators. We're not usually able to meet in person with them, but it's often easier for everybody to just Zoom, particularly if we got folks from around the state who are lobbying a particular legislator. So those are kind of the high level of where we are. The federal Iowa Nonprofit Alliance is another great organization. They have a web page here. Again, I'll drop this into the chat, that is very good for tracking what Iowa can do, what Iowans can do. Scott just dropped a YouTube link. I'm not sure, Scott, what that is in the chat. Did you want to share with folks what that is?
Yeah, it's Legal AF, Michael Popak. He's a very good attorney, and they are keeping everybody up to date on the developments in federal courts involving all of the multiplicity of actions that are pending. And I've found it to be a very good and reliable source for me to stay abreast of. He's very familiar with the judges that are involved, a lot of commentary. And frankly, from my standpoint as an attorney, it's a little reassuring to hear others commenting that, all is not lost.
Well, and that's important to remember, is this is the behavior of this administration in many ways is unprecedented, but part of what that means is, yeah, it's unnerving because it's not something we've seen before, but it also carries with it a likelihood from a legal standpoint, and Scott's a lawyer and I'm not, carries with it a likelihood from a legal standpoint that not all of it's going to stick. They're doing a lot of things that have sometimes questionable legal basis, and some of that may get unwound by the courts. Now, the courts take time, and that can have real impact on nonprofits in the meantime who may not have the ability to weather the 2 or 3 years that a case can take to wind through the courts. But at the same time, we should just keep in mind that this is not fixed. This is going to be turbulent for a while, and finding those good sources of information like the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance, like the National Council on Nonprofits, can help keep our rudders straight, as it were, keep us going in the direction we want to be going. Rather than
the day has finally come. We're announcing the launch of the Legal AF YouTube channel. We're not going anywhere. We're still on the Midas.
Great.
Somebody's listening to my link.
There you go. So moving on, real quick, just any questions on that before we move on? I'll move on then to the Iowa legislature, and we'll talk a little more specifically about things that we can directly affect at home, moving up to Cultural Advocacy Day on March 5th. So the Iowa Arts Council was reorganized 2 years ago. The reorganization was passed at the state level, and it's now under the Iowa Economic Development Authority, the IEDA. That's Debbie Durham's organization, for those who may know Debbie. David Schmitz has been the administrator for the Arts Council for the last 5 years or so. They did have a new website, and which prompted a kind of a funny moment this morning where I was texting David because I couldn't get to their website because they've just had a website migration. So that's the current website there. Obviously, we all know that the Arts Council is the state's main source of arts funding, and it also is the state agency that is the NEA pass-through, the National Endowment for the Arts, gets, as we know, distributes a certain amount of money directly to the states, and the Iowa Arts Council is the pass-through agency that takes that funding and applies it to Iowa organizations and opportunities. I will say that the movement to IEDA and the loss of the Department of Cultural Affairs, I think, was sad, in my opinion. The move to IEDA has carried with it some benefits. Debbie Durham is widely respected across the state, and I personally think she's quite good at her job, and she advocates for her organizations. So in the last couple of years, we have seen small increases in the Iowa Arts Council budget. They're not huge, but they are noteworthy because it's the first time in more than a decade that we have seen an increase in the Arts Council budget. Something to note was that in both of those cases where there was an increase to the budget, it was not in the governor's budget. The governor's budget does, again, ask for flat funding for the Iowa Arts Council. I think there's an advocacy opportunity for us to push for some continued increase in that. Usually it's been below the level of inflation. Our position at the Iowa Cultural Coalition, we would love to see the state move towards $1 per Iowan for arts and culture. We're a little bit agnostic as to how we hit that level. I would say that all told, current spending for arts and culture in Iowa is at about 70 cents per Iowan. So we'd like it to move up by about 30 cents per Iowan. I think that there are opportunities to move in that direction in this year. And there's going to be some important framing and messaging around that we'll get to in a minute. That's the Arts Council. There have been some recent wins in the last couple of years. $100 million investment in tourism destination infrastructure. That's the Destination Iowa funding. The funding for that came from the federal government through the American Rescue Plan Act. And the Inspire Iowa Cultural Tourism Grant through the IEDA, which is $250,000 annually. I will say also that the Create in Iowa report that we're going to talk about in a second is also a big lift from the Iowa Arts Council and in partnership with ICC, and is pretty significant as a look at the state's creative sector. We'll talk more in detail about that in a second. So as we talk to folks about legislative priorities, one of the things that we're hearing a lot still, again, is property tax reform. This has some real significant impacts for arts and culture. Property tax reform in the last session that was passed, it has capped out, and there's a weird hole in the cap in terms of the growth. Basically, communities are capped on the property tax increase that they can get, and as a result, property tax revenues for localities, cities and counties, has declined. So we've got our municipalities and localities that are having some real budget crises. Des Moines, where I live, is in a significant deficit this year. Polk County is looking at some challenges, and these are, relatively affluent areas. Looking across the state, this is going to hit some of our rural communities really, really hard. These changes to the property tax formulation that have already been passed by the legislature. The priority from conversations that I've had or heard for the Republican leadership, and we should mention here in terms of the legislative landscape, we know that Iowa has a Republican trifecta. They have a governor is Republican, as are the Senate and the House, and they have super majorities in both houses. So effectively, whatever Kim Reynolds wants and gets her legislative allies to agree to is going to pass. That's the reality of the electoral landscape that we're working in currently. As we're looking at that, property tax reform, again, could have significant impact on the funding and revenue for, again, counties and cities across the state. We are seeing, Bravo Greater Des Moines, which is a regional arts council here in central Iowa, has communities that are pulling out of its agreements to fund that have funded that with 2/7 of their hotel motel tax for a number of years. So it's a significant issue in terms of what is possible for the state legislature. But I would also say that property tax reform increasingly highlights the importance of the state's investment in arts and culture as we move forward, because a lot of these things that have been happening at the local level are not going to be happening as municipalities and counties make decisions about critical infrastructure. they're not going to be investing in arts and culture. And I think it will be increasingly important that the state take a look at how they can support that. One of the key reasons for that is one of the also huge concerns that we have in the state of Iowa, and that's workforce development. The attraction and retention of talent in a global competitive marketplace is difficult to do. There's a lot of discussion around property tax reform is about making Iowa more attractive to talent. There are other bills that are at play in the legislature that make it less attractive to many kinds of talent. And I think it's important to recognize that it is a key need for leaders across the state. When you talk with folks at chambers of commerce across Iowa, workforce is one of the key issues. The reason that's important for arts and culture organizations is that we're going to see in a minute, this is obviously where arts and culture has a key role to play in terms of attracting and retaining talent. This is an important thing to make sure that our leaders understand the key role that arts and culture investment has in building strong communities and attracting and retaining people to those communities, as we're going to see a little bit evidence that we can arm you for that. Arts and cultural issues in general, given everything else in the state, are largely flying under the radar. Again, the governor is proposing a no increase of flat funding for the Iowa Arts Council. When you talk with David Schmitz, he says, I'll take flat over cuts any day. But one thing that we need to think about moving forward with that property tax reform, already not ahead of any additional property tax reform that the legislature may take up this year, the state is projecting deficit budgets starting in fiscal year 26. Fiscal year 26 starts July 1st. So the state is looking at a deficit budget starting July 1st. That could well lead to additional cuts in the budget. There is some discussion of using the state's reserves as a backfill. That is obviously not a sustainable position. It is a short-term fix at best, even though the reserves are currently considerable. So that's something to be aware of as well. Should have moved on to this a little earlier. First round obviously is affecting. The second round could make be having deeper impact. Changes to taxes and spending, opening up that budget deficit. That Iowa Capital Dispatch piece, you can take a look at that. I'll drop that link in the chat as well. Now, talking about those workforce concerns, we are a state that needs immigration. Interestingly, the growth in Iowa's population has largely come from people of color in the last several years. Our smaller communities have difficulty filling jobs. Often they may have jobs that go unfilled because they can't get talent to come and stay. Housing is also a concern. Housing is also an area where investment in arts and culture can it can make a community more attractive to housing developers because they think it's going to be easier to sell those houses if there's more going on in that community. We've got the story about 2/3 of Iowa's counties have lost population. That was certainly true in the period from 2010 to 2020. We haven't seen any evidence of that trend turning around since then. Arts and culture, again, is not just a nicety, but a necessity. It is one of the top 3 reasons people choose, according to surveys, when they move into a community. Usually the top 3 are jobs, safety, and arts and culture. So that's a key factor and one of the ones that you can drive pretty easily with a relatively low investment. This is all part of the messaging that we're looking for. So the Create in Iowa report, this was announced this week. There was a press release, and there's a link to that on the Iowa Cultural Coalition website. Create in Iowa was an in-depth look at the creative sector in Iowa. Broad-based, defined as those organizations, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, that produce, practice, promote, and preserve performance in arts and culture and heritage in the state. It is, I think, the most comprehensive look at Iowa's creative sector that has been put together. It was its value here, and if it's a pretty report. It's really beautiful. They've got a wonderful Gozian who did the graphic design on it. It looks great. One of the key things I'm going to urge you, and I think Holly just dropped the link in the chat. One of the key things I'm going to urge you is, if this report just sits on people's hard drives or desks, it's not going to do what it needs to do. This was really built as a tool for advocacy. And I so appreciate all of you being here, because this is to equip you to go out and talk to your lawmakers, persuade them, and arm you with the facts and statistics that communicate to them in language they can understand the value of arts and culture in the state, the impact that the creative economy has in Iowa, and the importance of leveraging that impact to continue to grow our workforce, to continue to grow our population, and to continue to grow our economy. So preparation. The Iowa Arts Council had public input sessions last year from February to April. Information was collected and gathered from those and formed the basis for the report. Then MacIver Communications and the Iowa Arts Council put out a survey to arts and culture leaders. We had roughly 200 respondents, I think a little under 200 respondents, who filled out this survey, and that again provided another pool of information. We also conducted 15 one-on-one interviews with leaders who were not in arts and culture. It was important to us to understand how people outside of the creative sector saw the functioning of the creative sector and the importance of the creative sector. We got some great insight into how crucial arts and culture is to this state from people who are not in it. From an executive at John Deere, people who are connected perhaps through philanthropic organizations or community foundations, but folks also who are in economic development formed part of that interview group. Those 15 interviews were really insightful and formed a lot of the key findings that came out of Create in Iowa. And it, again, was a partnership among the Iowa Arts Council, the Iowa Cultural Coalition, and MacIver Communications. So, findings. Arts and culture, we all know, are an economic driver for Iowa. 42,000 jobs, $5 billion in economic impact. We are a sector that is bigger than transportation, around the size of education. And as a sector, that 42,000, that's larger than many of the largest employers in Iowa. So it's a significant portion of the population, more than a lot of people think. Interestingly, we are 23rd among all states in arts and cultural employment growth, even though we are 42nd in arts and cultural per capita funding. So I think there's a tremendous story of success there. Workforce development and attraction retention are top priorities that resonate with the legislators. And again, arts and culture is a top 3 factor for people in deciding where they're going to move. Economic impact data in the report are also important when you're connecting with legislators. There's a number of, I'm not going to give you all the quotes and figures. You can click the link. You can take a look at the report. We strongly urge you to digest it and highlight your favorite stats. Those economic development stats are really going to connect with legislators and leaders where they live and work and where they understand the impact of arts and culture. So, things that we want to do as an industry. These are things that the Iowa Arts Council will likely be looking at working with partners across the state. We want to promote better regional coordination so that we can leverage our regional artistic assets, our artistic infrastructure to serve more Iowans and more communities. Cross-sector partnerships was something that came up a lot. Leverage expanded investment in the full range of the creative sector. So we're talking about, philanthropy cooperating with government, cooperating with business, cooperating with nonprofits, finding those collaborations and coordination. We want to better connect Iowans who are in the creative sector with existing business resources and opportunities. Sometimes Iowans who are running creative businesses don't think of themselves like a small business that can access all of the resources that are available at the state for a small business. And sometimes, we found this during the pandemic, sometimes opportunities are created for small businesses that don't include nonprofits or don't include arts and culture in a way that makes sense. So we want to make sure that those connections are there for everyone. We also want to find increased growth in Iowa's creative sector. Again, that's 42,000 jobs, $5 billion is kind of that headline statistic. It's important to find new ways to bring revenue into that sector. I think that in general, the Arts Council is open to thoughts from the legislature on what the mechanism for that would look like. I think there are some really interesting possibilities, but I think that one of the main themes that we heard over and over, particularly in those one-on-one interviews, and again, those were with people not in the arts and culture sector, was it needs more. We need more investment in it. And you'll hear me use that term a lot. I tend to refer to investment in arts and culture, not funding for arts and culture, because we're really looking at a strategy for growth here, not a handout. I've covered a lot. Was there anything in the chat, Paul? Any questions?
No.
Great. If folks have questions, just drop them in the chat and we'll hit them as we go. We will have a Q&A at the end. I want to make sure that I give time for that. I want to cover some ground here. So how to leverage Create in Iowa. First thing, get and read the report. We've got links in the chat for you. Take a look at it. I think it's some really, I mean, I can't say I'm unbiased in this regard, but I think a lot of people worked on this, and I think there's some really great insights into what is really going on in our state at a high level, but also across the state. Share this with colleagues. So if you folks who aren't able to make it onto the call today, tell them about the report, send them the link. I think it's important. We want to get this thing into as many people's hands as possible because we want to arm as many people as possible with as much information about the creative sector so that they are as persuasive as possible for their legislators and leaders about the importance of investment in arts and culture. If you have an opportunity for the Iowa Cultural Coalition to go and talk to somebody, you've got a Kiwanis group, you've got a summit of some kind that's coming up in your area, you've got some kind of panel discussion going on, please reach out to the Iowa Cultural Coalition. I will also drop my email in the chat and let us know what your opportunities are. We want to talk to as many people as we can about this across the state. We may not be able to do everything, but gosh, we would sure love to try. So don't worry that it's too big or too small. We'll take a crack at it. We would love an opportunity to come and share this information in your community. And lastly, and most importantly, use the information and the data in the report in your advocacy. And that's what we're going to talk about next is advocacy, how to do it, tools and techniques. So the key things, some key things about advocacy, and I will just full on admit that I've shamelessly cribbed a bunch of this from Leon, who gave a presentation on this last year. Advocacy is telling your story and educating others about arts and culture in Iowa. It's establishing working relationships with decision makers. And one thing that I want to constantly lift up is arts and culture funding is a nonpartisan issue. It has become partisan in many respects, but this is not something that is one party owns and one party doesn't. And we need to have folks on all sides of the aisle who can understand the value of arts and culture. So one of the strategies for that, as you're talking about folks and you're telling your story, again, just to highlight what we've talked about a little bit so far, we're talking about investment in arts and culture. We're talking about growing the state. We're talking about the importance of attracting and retaining talent. Everybody on this call, I think, understands the life-changing power of the arts. Everybody on this call understands the intrinsic beauty that arts and culture brings to our lives. When you're in a conversation with someone, say a legislator in your community or some other community leader, who maybe doesn't share that perspective with you, the key thing is to think about your audience and what are the things that drive them. That's one of the reasons that you'll hear me talk a lot about economic development or attracting and retaining talent. It's not that I don't think that the arts are intrinsically valuable in and of themselves. I think they should be funded inherently for their own value. But I've come to recognize that the people who already believe that already agree with me, and the people who don't are the ones we actually need if we're going to get a bill passed. So thinking of that framework that we're presenting here, competitiveness is hugely important for the state of Iowa. And framing our investment in arts and culture in terms of our competitiveness of our economy, the competitiveness of our ability to attract and retain talent, is going to connect with people who don't already understand the importance of investing in arts and culture. Hopefully, the ones who do understand that importance are already on our side and going to vote for it anyway. So why should we advocate for the arts? One reason is when we don't, people assume that it's either okay or not important. Number two, I think, is in the chaos, particularly when you think about what's going on at the federal level, if we don't speak up, obviously there's going to look for targets for cutting at the federal level. That's already going on. They're going to look for targets quite possibly at the state level in the next year or two as we're looking at deficit budgets. Positioning arts and culture as important to our state, important to solving our biggest problem in terms of workforce, is one of the best ways to move out of that danger zone and into the zone of a necessity, not a nicety. That's really what we are driving here. Every person makes a difference. You guys are all experts in your field, even if you've never advocated before. Some of you may have. Drop in the chat if you've ever lobbied a legislator on behalf of arts and culture. Say yes in the chat. If you haven't, say no. I'm curious as to what folks' experience level is with this kind of work. So one of the key principles, we're talking about this, and one reason why it's important to see on your call, that you're on the call today, rather, is a unified message. We have two specific asks that we're going to be pushing for. Scott has, Linda advocated with Leon. Yeah, Leon is a gateway drug for advocacy for many of us. So we want to have a unified message. The message, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's important to have constituents. Legislators are going to listen to people in their district. They're going to care less if you buttonhole a legislature and you bend their ear about the importance of arts and culture. They're going to care less if you're not one of their voters. Just how they're driven. The important thing is too, it's about you being you. The importance to you, the importance to your community. You don't have to pretend or fake or put on anything. We're going to try and give you all the tools that you need to tell your story effectively and authentically. It should be a part of your regular activity. And one thing that we'll touch on later, we would love to have all of you join us March 5th at Cultural Advocacy Day. But just as important, when your legislators have coffees in the community, when you have business events that legislators are going to be at, when there are roundtables. I went to actually a technology event, and I ended up bending Janet Peterson, who's my senator, so I was her constituent. I ended up bending her ear for about 15 minutes on all the things I thought were wrong with the world, but I had the opportunity because I was out there making these cases at an event already. So engaging in those kind of community activities that you're out and about in, coming across your legislators and having those things to say, those 3 or 4 bullet points when you get to them is important. So be part of your regular activities. So get to know folks. One of the things that's great about state legislators, they'll meet with you. It's harder during session. They're busier during session, and we'll talk about getting in to see them during session. But particularly during the off season, drop them an email, have a cup of coffee with them, tell them what's on your mind, tell them what's important to you. If you build ongoing professional relationships with them, you have that relationship when you need it. The other thing, the point about knowledge is power, I think, is a really good one. You guys are subject matter experts for your organizations, for your areas. And it's important that the legislators understand the impacts that some of these bigger decisions. And honestly, I think property tax reform is a great example of this. I think that there are a lot of legislators who probably wouldn't draw a line between, say, libraries and property tax reform. But when budgets get cut, institutions can close as a result of this higher level decision-making process. We can help connect those dots for legislators, and we can help share impacts with them about these policies that they may feel, if they don't hear about any of the pain points that come about as the result of some of these fiscal policies, they may think everything's fine again. That's why it's important to get out there, connect with your legislators, build those relationships, tell them stories about those impacts. Staff also, just to follow up on Leon's point, staff are hugely important. Staff actually set schedules. Staff actually, when you're lobbying, particularly federal legislators, a lot of times your meeting is going to be with a staffer. That's what you're going to get. That's okay. Those people can wield tremendous power. So it's worth it to build those relationships. So options, emails, letters, social media, they're pretty good. They get a blizzard of those. I would say that they're not going to be hugely affected. A lot of times too, I mean, we all sign up for it, but they'll get their inbox with these petitions or so forth, or these messages that get sent to them. It's a volume game at that point. Virtual and in-person meetings are really good. Connecting one-on-one or group-on-one with the legislator is really important. Attending town hall or coffee meetings and asking a question about arts and culture, and making sure that as they're having these conversations in a non-arts environment, say in Des Moines, the Greater Des Moines Partnership puts on a couple of legislative events every year. Well, we try and go to those, and we try to talk to legislators about arts and culture, or ask a question about arts and culture in this non-arts and culture environment, because you're raising the awareness for people that this is something that Iowans care about. And we've done polling that shows Iowans care enormously about arts and culture. Becoming a resource to the elected official when they have a question about something is hugely valuable. If they want to know what the impact is on something and they know to call you, that's great. So thinking about how you can offer them that kind of information can be hugely helpful to them. Legislators are deluged with all kinds of topics, all kinds of perspectives. They don't have time to be an expert in everything. They need to rely on people in their community, constituents, who can talk to them and say, this is going to matter to these people. This is going to be good for these people. This is going to be bad for these people. And that's important to them. And then be a part of a larger network of arts advocates, the Iowa Cultural Coalition, Alliance for Arts Education, Americans for the Arts, the Creative States Coalition. These are organizations that are going to advocate for arts and culture, and you can raise your voice through them. So, whoop, went the wrong way. So advocacy is about policy, not personality. This is kind of a key point. You can have a persuasive argument with someone even if you find them frustrating. You can make a connection with someone about something that they care about even if you don't agree. Again, this is not a partisan issue. This is local policy affecting local constituents. It's state policy affecting people across Iowa. Don't assume that you know a legislator's position, particularly about arts and culture. It's been fascinating to me to sit down with some of these legislators. Randy Feenstra, one of Iowa's House members at the Federal House of Representatives, had great experiences with arts as a kid, and his kids have had great experiences with arts, and he's a supporter of arts and culture funding. You wouldn't necessarily assume that from his position or some of his other positions, but for arts and culture particularly, because we all know how important it is and how it can touch your heart, you'd be surprised at the people who have had an experience or had a connection. They played in an ensemble or a band, or they were in theater, or they did something in some other art, and it affected them in a way that even decades later they talk about it, and they light up in a different way recounting that particular story than when you were just talking about the dry policy. So that's a power that we have as arts and culture advocates, that it can touch the heart, and it can move you, and it can drive you to find some unlikely allies. So research and ask them about that. We talk about 3 pillars of advocacy with arts and culture, and this is in line with what we were talking about with the findings in the Create in Iowa report. Arts and culture attract and retain talent. Arts and culture drive economic development, and arts and culture build strong communities. These are points that we want to hammer on. This is not a one-year messaging, too. This is something that we've been talking about consistently. That consistency is important. We want the legislators to understand why the arts are so essential to Iowa. So, our asks for 2025. First one, we still hold the goal of investing $1 per Iowan for arts and culture. Right now, we're at about 70 cents per Iowan. We are 42nd in the nation. Here's the thing, legislators don't care what our ranking is. It doesn't matter to them. We may look at that and say that's shameful. Iowa should be higher. They don't care, but they do care about competitiveness. They do care about attracting and retaining talent. So that's where it's important to emphasize that this investment in arts and culture is about drawing people to the state. It's about building strong communities. It's about driving that economic development. And all of those things, you can find specifics about that in the Create in Iowa report. We also would like to establish a creative sector task force with legislative participation and leadership. This would be a task force that would really look at how to leverage Iowa's creative sector, take the findings in the Create in Iowa report to grow the population and workforce, which is the top need that we have in the state right now. Those are the two big asks, and those are something that certainly, I mean, for individual organizations, if you're arts and culture organization, you know, if we can get more funding through, there's more opportunity for all of us. If we can get them to put this task force together and increasingly recognize the value of the creative sector, the value of arts and culture, then we have an opportunity as the state moves into fiscally challenging times in the next few years to be at the forefront as a problem, as a solution to the problem, rather, as a solution to the problem, rather than as something that maybe we should cut because we need to save money in the budget. It's like, no, we need to invest in arts and culture in order to attract and retain talent to drive more economic development. We need to keep this going because it's already vital and important. And if we invest, we can get even more out of it. So for Cultural Advocacy Day coming up on March 5th, again, we can do in-person advocacy or we can do online advocacy. You can send an email, personalized email to your representatives, or you can send a letter, you can make a phone call, you can meet with them in your office. I think if you have an organization space and you can host a legislator at your organization and show them the work that you do and the impact that you have in the community, if for those of you in that situation, that is an absolutely fantastic opportunity.
Matt, would you mind touching on the restrictions on gifts to legislators and so forth? We can't just be taking them to dinner.
You can't take them to dinner. You can't take them to lunch. When I had beer with Austin Bates, who's my representative, he bought, because I think it's I think for state employees, I think it's like $3.
Yeah.
For the legislators, I think it's the same, Scott. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's, maybe you can buy them a Costco hot dog, but that's about it. I think those kinds of caps are important. It's important that we don't have a lot of bribery and gifts flowing towards our legislators, but it does mean that when you invite them to, don't try and take them out to dinner. Instead, make sure that you have an opportunity to connect with them in a way that is within those bounds of propriety. It's a good point. Thank you, Scott.
Unless you're reaching out to a U.S. Supreme Court justice, and then apparently,
sure.
I'm not sure what they can do.
Buy them an RV, fly them to the Bahamas, whatever works for you. I'm not in that bracket, unfortunately. Oh shoot, it's February. You should say 28th there. So I thought I fixed that. So if you wanted to engage in the virtual side of Cultural Advocacy Day, the Iowa Cultural Coalition will send you an email template that you can personalize and send to your legislators, and contact information for your representative and senator. We'll send you supporting materials, and we would ask that you forward that to your representatives on the 4th or the 5th of March. So we'll get those to you by the end of February, and then on the 4th or the 5th, we'd ask you to forward those. Add a personal note to those. They want to hear from you specifically. And again, in your note, again, referencing those 3 pillars: attracting and retaining talent, driving economic development, building strong communities, are key messages that we want to do. The in-person option, we would love to have any of you join us who would care to. We will be at the Iowa Capitol on March 5th, starting at 7 a.m. Our bribe that I am always sure to tell legislators when I talk to them about Cultural Advocacy Day is that Paul will bring us pastries from Lamy, which is a great pastry shop here in town. If you've had them, you know. So we bribe them with carbohydrates. It's not a bribe. But we offer them a snack, and we share information with them about these key things that we're looking for. Again, $1 per Iowan for the arts, that hashtag one for the arts that was on that slide, and also forming a creative sector task force to look at leveraging Iowa's creative economy to attract and retain talent and grow our state, our population, our economy. From 9 to 11, we'll be in the rotunda, and we'll visit with the legislators who stop by for a delicious pastry. From 9:30 to 12, we then try to meet with legislators. If you're able to connect with your legislator ahead of time before Cultural Advocacy Day and let them know that you're coming and set up a meeting, that's actually ideal. So if you can call or email their office or use a scheduling portal to try to connect with them ahead of time to be there for Cultural Advocacy Day, for those of you who are reaching out or constituents of a particular legislator, that is absolutely ideal. Once you tell them you're a constituent, obviously that's important. What you're going to be talking about and who will be with you. Be flexible if you can on dates and times if you're able to do that. If you're able to join us on Cultural Advocacy Day, let's see, do we have? There are meeting request slips outside each of the chambers that we then hand to a page and send in, and the legislators, if they're there and are able, come out and talk in the lobby. So it's literal lobbying. So that's what we'll be doing from 9:30 to 12. Any meetings that we're able to schedule ahead of time will be great. We will then, for those that we haven't been able to schedule or haven't gotten a reply from, we'll try to send in slips for those we have constituents for. So this is really great if you're able to join us from across the state. I understand it's a drive for a lot of folks to get down to Des Moines, but it's a great opportunity to connect with your legislators, to be part of a group when you're having these conversations, and to just be there, meet some folks from all over the place, and enjoy sharing how important arts and culture is with our decision makers. Obviously, you want to have your talking points. You want to know who's going to talk about what if you've got more than one person in your group. You want to share personal stories, but also include some of the data, particularly that we have in the Create in Iowa report. If you have a leave behind you can give them, that's great. This is important more and more in this day and age. Take a photo with them and post it on social media and tag them. They're all trying to be out there and on the interwebs in the way that makes sense for them. So help them with that. Thank them for their time and then follow up. So follow up, this is the point. Add them to your mailing list is great. If you have an organizational mailing list, invite them to events, visit their district office and meet the staff, arrange opportunities for them to visit and to learn from arts supporters, attend their town hall meetings and any Zoom meetings that they have. If you can drop a note after meeting them and thank them for their time, that's always great as well. We've got a video. I'm going to skip the video actually, and just make sure we've got time for a Q&A. The video is on our website. It's a nice little advocacy video. Just talks about the importance of arts and culture in Iowa. Holly has dropped into the chat the link that you can sign up for Advocacy Day. Thank you so much. What questions do people have? Covered a good bit of ground here. And if you want, you can just hop off mute and ask questions or drop them in the chat if that's easier for you.
Matt, I'll throw one out there. Being a lifelong liberal Democrat, I haven't voted for any of the people that are in office.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it awkward to try to approach them when I am personally so opposed to most of what they've been doing. but I'm trying to put that behind me. And I suspect there may be others who, have similar leanings. And I'm sure that the legislators that we're talking to suspect, if it's a group of arts advocates, they are not their donors. May not be in this legislative climate anyway. So what suggestions might you make, or Paul, would you make, for bridging that gap, making them more comfortable, making yourself more comfortable, and so we can have those conversations? Because I think it's important.
That's a great question, Scott. And the first thing I would say is where you ended your question in terms of bridging. There are things that even people we disagree with vehemently about politics, there are things that we care about that we have in common. And if we're able to start with those things, we want this to be a healthy state. We want this to be a thriving state. We want people to live good lives here. We want people to move here and build a life here and add to our state. We really need that from an economic perspective. And I think we want, those of us with kids would like a state that has enough opportunity for them to maybe stick around and have an opportunity to build their own lives here. So I think starting from those areas of common ground, and if you're able, particularly with a particular legislator, to say, hey, I know that economic development is important to you. One of the things you may not have thought about is the key role that arts and culture plays in making a community attractive for economic development. Or I know housing's been an issue for you. It's important when developers are looking at a community, they look at what are the cultural offerings in the community, because it's going to make it easier for them to sell the house. So one way that we can drive economic development in the state, one way that we can attract and retain talent in the state, is through this process of investing in our arts and culture, investing in, the heritage, what makes us special. I totally understand, Scott, and one of the reasons I phrase things the way that I do is you're trying to think about the people that we're appealing to, again, who are not probably the most in agreement with us in a lot. Linda dropped, you dropped that in. Linda, do you want to raise your comment that you dropped in the chat there?
When I was advocating with Leon, when we had the Arts Alliance Advocacy Day in January, I was amazed, and it was very comfortable to talk to legislators that I really didn't know about and you mentioned this, Matt, about their experience personally, or their children having some positive or grandchildren positive experience, to the point where I thought we probably should ask them to form a band or a choir of legislators, because a lot of them, no matter what their politics are, a lot of them had something to tell me.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and a real advantage that arts and culture has over maybe the soybean producers, that we've got a lot of people who've been touched by the work that we do. So I think that's great.
Scott, I just want to jump in here. Also, to pick up on Matt's point, yes, definitely find, the common ground. And for me, it would be, I want to share with you something about an issue that affects the state in a positive way, whether it's in terms of economic development, whatever. But my main point is, I want to give you information. I'm not here to persuade you, because very rarely does someone get persuaded on the first time. And I think if you approach it from, here's some information I would like you to have, And if you have any questions about it, I'll be glad to discuss it with you, rather than immediately trying to convince them that they're doing the wrong thing. Just say, here's some information that I think would be useful to you and I think would help you make a more informed decision about issues affecting the state.
I think too, to that point, the more you're able to frame what you're asking for as a solution to a problem they have. I'll give you an example. When I was part of a group that started an organization called the Des Moines Social Club, and we went around and told everybody how great this organization was going to be for artists, and nobody gave us $1 because they didn't particularly see that artists had a problem. Then we went around and we told everyone that this was going to attract and retain talent to Central Iowa, and people started writing checks because they had a problem attracting and retaining talent, and they saw this as a solution. So again, I don't think that in the arts, the Create an Iowa report will show this. We don't have to make anything up about how valuable this is. What we have to do is, to Paul's point, is to educate people on the existing impact of the arts and the possibility to leverage that impact to grow the state. So,
yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we're right at time. Anything else? I know we've had some folks who had to step away. Well, thank you, everyone, for your for coming today. We've got, I know pretty much everybody on this call to this point, but thank you all for sticking around to the end. We appreciate it, and we hope to see everybody at Cultural Advocacy Day on the 5th of March.
Well done.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that.